Okay, welcome everybody. It gives me I'm sorry about that. I apologize. Can everyone hear me? Thumbs up if you can. Okay, I was just saying welcome to our audience in the LSE on Zoom, the students in the Marshall Building, as well as those who are individually signed on and other LSE guests. And welcome to all our YouTube watchers now and when you catch up with this afterwards. Um, So I just need to remind everybody, this is being taped, this is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. We will have about an hour of talk and an hour and 10 minutes of talk and commentary to begin with, and then move to Q&A. And everyone is welcome to type their questions in the chat function on Zoom, or to send in a question from the YouTube through the chat mechanism that's there. So I think that's all the instructions. And so now I really want to welcome our speaker. It's a long time in coming, this this session of the cutting edge issues in development thinking and practice. And I'm really delighted that Isabella Weber has taken the time out to talk to us about her really much celebrated book, her first book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. This book won the Joan Robinson Prize last year, 2021, and it's been much celebrated. I mean, it got on Martin Wolf's summer reading list last summer in the Financial Times. Scholars in both in China studies and in development economics have lauded the book, including, the doyen of China studies, Dwight Perkins, Peter Nolan, the founder of the head of the China Center at Cambridge, and in fact, a founding member of the development studies at Cambridge, and people such as James Galbraith, Branko Milanovic, who was with us earlier in the series, Danny Roderick have sung the praises of this really important piece of work. So Isabella is assistant professor of economics and the research leader for China at the PERI, or the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, one of the best places doing research on development, on environmental matters from a political economy perspective in the United States, and established by my old friend Jim Boyce, who I hope is watching this lecture in some form or another. And if you are, my greetings. It also gives me enormous pleasure to welcome back to the LSE Professor Andrew Fisher. He is Professor of Inequality, Social Protection and Development at the ISS, the Institute of Social Studies at The Hague, which is part of the Erasmus University Rotterdam. He's Scientific Director of CERES, the Dutch Research School for International Development. He's co-editor of the journal Development and Change, a founding editor of the Oxford University Press book series, Critical Frontiers of International Development Studies. Andrew is an expert on social policy, and he cut his teeth doing research on social policy in China, especially in the Tibetan areas of China. I had the great pleasure of being able to supervise that work long ago. Here's a case where the student far out, and achieves far beyond his former mentor, which I love to see. So I try to take just a little bit of credit for Andrew, but we're very lucky to have Andrew as a critical thing, one of the important thinkers in development studies today. And I think he won't shy away from asking Isabella difficult questions. Just before you start, Isabella, I want to say that I had a long-term interest in China way back from the early 1970s, and learned a lot about China from a mentor who was also, Andrew also knew too, Professor Sam Numoff at McGill University. And Numoff played an important role as an advisor to Zhu Rongji. And so we had some direct kind of insight into the early days of reform and what was going on. I mean, Numoff was one of the people who could maybe take a small credit for advising, particularly about avoiding some of the problems that were emerging in other parts of the developing world in relationship to the kinds of marketizing reforms that then went on to be so important in the shock therapies that leveled many economies of the former Soviet Union and of Eastern Europe. So I think gives us a lot of pleasure to see you doing this work, this important work, in explaining the different direction that China is taking. So I'll be quiet now and turn over the screen to Isabella.
Thank you so much, Professor Puzzle. This is wonderful, and it's very humbling to hear you speak about my work in that way. Thank you so much for the invitation. This is a really terrific opportunity. And I'm also really delighted that Andrew has agreed to be the commentator for this event. After this event, I hope to learn more about Numoff's role. I wasn't aware of that part of the history. So thank you so much for bringing that up. Let me maybe also mention, since I realize that there are many students here in development studies, that when I started out doing this project, it was really pretty heretic to be asking such a big question and to be pursuing such a historical, qualitative kind of work out of development economics. And I just want to share this in the spirit of encouraging everybody to pursue the kind of questions that you really care about and that you really find important, rather than necessarily narrowing yourself by thinking that you can only ask questions that are a variety of a theme that you pick up from somewhere else, where you just add a little footnote. Not to say that I have done more than adding a footnote, but just to encourage you to pursue the real questions that you care about. Okay, let me share my screen. The title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, the Market Reform Debate. At the core, this is really a book about the 1980s. And when I was pursuing this project, I could not have known that this whole theme of the end of the Cold War and the ways in which China came out of the Cold War would be such a topical issue by the time my book is coming out. And sadly, this is for the most unsettling political reasons. So I think in some sense, by taking us back to the 1980s, I am providing a context for the kind of challenges and the kind of reorganization in the global economy that we are facing today. In the book, I'm conceptualizing the 1980s as a crossroads in the global economy. I'm thinking of it as the beginning of China's economic convergence with the West. That is, its economic convergence in terms of its weight in the global economy. However, this economic convergence did not come along with a wholesale institutional assimilation. China's institutions did not become like those in the United States or Europe in a wholesale fashion, even though China deeply marketized. And I think that the tension between the economic convergence, the lack of wholesale institutional assimilation, while at the same time, this deep marketization that involved an integration into global capitalism occurred is part of the tension that is defining our present moment. The 1980s is also a crossroads when we compare the fate of the two former giants of state socialism in the 20th century, that is Russia and China. In that sense, it's a divergence between Russia's fall and China's rise, which can be linked to a difference in approaches to market reforms. To be sure, my book is about China and not about Russia. I'm also not arguing that Russia's economic fall can be explained with a simple choice between either shock therapy or not shock therapy, and that's the end of it. Rather, by pointing to the outcomes of economic reform in Russia, I just want to illustrate what was at stake in the Chinese case, without necessarily making any specific new contributions or creating new insights on the Russian case. So if we look at the 1980s from a long run perspective, if we look at it from the very simple measure that is share in world GDP, we can see that if we go back to the early 19th century, for China, the 1980s is a turning point that marks the end of China's long fall in the world economy and the beginning of its re-emergence. In contrast, for the USSR, it marks the beginning of its decline. For Western Europe and the United States, the 1980s basically mark the beginning of what looks more and more like a very slow shrinking in relation to China, or broadly speaking, a form of stagnation. So in that sense, I'm talking about the 1980s as a turning point. Of course, share in GDP, share in world GDP is a very crude measure. This here is the medicine data, and we can debate whether medicine GDP data for the early 19th century is necessarily terrifically accurate and so on. But I do think that it does capture a very broad trends where we want to emphasize the trends and not necessarily the specific numbers. If we zoom into the Russian case and ask ourselves, how did the two crucial macroeconomic indicators evolve as Russia was moving out of the planned economy and into the market economy, then we can see that inflation really skyrocketed. Please note that this graph is on a logarithmic scale. Since we could not even plot this on a regular scale, the inflation graph would be shooting through the roof. I don't know in what building you are sitting, so that might be a rough statement. For my building, it certainly is true. Whereas in contrast, the GDP here looks as if it merely stagnated. In reality, this only looks this way because inflation exploded so much. In fact, the 1990s saw a very dramatic collapse in GDP. And this was not only a collapse in GDP, but also a collapse in life expectancy, public health, access to public education, and so on. So a whole range of key indicators of social welfare rapidly declined as a result of the transition into a market economy. Now my slide is no longer moving. Here we go. If we look at the same two indicators in relation to the Chinese case, that is again, inflation measured in terms of consumer price index and GDP, we can see that almost consistently, GDP growth outpaced inflation, with the exception of the late 90s, which also happens to be the most neoliberal moment in China's development trajectory. Now, from the perspective of development economics, this is not a small deal, since China, as we know, experienced one of the fastest growth episodes on record in human history, really. And we know that periods of very fast growth tend to be inflationary. In the case of China, this very fast growth was not inflationary if we measure the relationship between the pace of increase in the general price level and the pace of increase in GDP. Another way of looking at this comparison is to ask what happened with inequality. And we can see in this graph, which plots the incomes, average incomes per adult by population quantiles from 1980 to 2015, drawing on the data compiled by Piketty and co-authors, that in both cases, inequality increased rapidly. In the case of China, the increase in inequality coincided with an increase in the absolute levels. So in other words, the growth in income at the top outpaced the growth of income at the bottom. In the case of Russia, we see a general, very severe decline in incomes, and then again, an outpacing of the higher income groups in the growth phase from the late 1990s compared to the lower income groups. This then has resulted in a situation where by 2013 or so, the bottom 99% in China have outpaced the income per adult in comparison to Russia. So in other words, in both cases, we have seen very drastic and concerning problems with inequality, but in one case with a general rise of levels, and in the other case preceded by a very drastic decline of the general levels. So if this is the case, if the outcome of marketization stands in such sharp contrast between these two former giants of socialism, it raises the question, what was the economic policy that was part of facilitating the transition? In the case of Russia, the answer to this question is very straightforward, or relatively straightforward, and it's been called shock therapy by those advocating the kind of economic policies that were implemented, as well as by those who later came to be critical of these kind of policies. Now, shock therapy, very broadly speaking, is a package of a range of different economic policy measures, which are all meant to create a market economy out of a planned economy. And the basic logic is that you have to abolish the planned economy in order to make space for the market economy to emerge. This meant that in the first instance, all prices should be liberalized, since, as you might have learned in your economics textbooks, first of all, you need to get the prices right. If you don't have price signals, you basically don't have a market from the perspective of textbook economics. So the liberalization of all prices should then be facilitated by macroeconomic austerity, where the idea is that through monetary and fiscal restraint, the general price level could be controlled, and it could be prevented that prices would be spiraling entirely out of control beyond a certain initial burst in inflation. Footnote, if you remember the graph that I showed you on inflation, it's pretty clear that this macroeconomic austerity did not perform the function that it was meant to perform. Thirdly, trade liberalization was meant to integrate the newly created market economies into the world economy, and then privatization should ensure that there would be market actors that are responding to these price signals. However, even the most committed shock therapists acknowledge that privatization is a complicated and slow process of institutional rebuilding, and therefore it would take time. So the only thing that really can be implemented overnight and as one big shock was thought of as the liberalization of all prices. So from this perspective, then, the Big Bang that is meant to initiate the transition to a market economy was really composed of the liberalization of all prices combined with macroeconomic austerity. Okay, so much about the abstract basic logic of shock therapy. If China's outcomes of reform were so drastically different, this raises the question what the intellectual foundations of China's reform approach might have been, or in other words, what was the economics of China's market reforms. As for example, Danny Roderick, who has been mentioned before, wrote in 2010, there has not been a greater instance of poverty reduction in history than that of China in the quarter century since the late 1970s. Yet, can anyone name the Western economists or the piece of research that played an instrumental role in China's reforms? So for a long time, it was not clear what the kind of economics was that underpinned China's market reforms. There have been contributions before my book, of course. This is a quote from 2010, but I'm basically trying to also respond to this question. And through interviews that I have conducted with a whole range of economists in China that were critically involved in the first decade of reforms, and then by engaging with a whole wealth of primary sources from China, but also from private archives, for example, on the part of World Bank officials, I try to reconstruct the ways in which economists have thought about China's market reforms in order to uncover the intellectual underpinnings of China's reform approach. Okay, with this broad framing in mind, let us go back to the late 1970s in China, which is the beginning of China's economic reforms. So first of all, we have to ask ourselves, why was there an urge for reform to begin with? In some sense, we can say that the idea of development economics, or the idea of economic development for the sake of economic development, only really begins or re-emerges in China in the late 1970s, since during the Maoist period, the idea was that there should be a primacy of political development, in particular during the Cultural Revolution and late Maoism, where the idea was that the emphasis should be on continuous revolution and on revolutionizing the social forms of organization in order to achieve ever more socialist forms of social organization. Basically, the idea was that there was a hope that economic development would follow from these more progressive, more socialist forms of political and social and economic organization. That being said, there has been an ambition to achieve industrialization and to achieve economic development going back to the revolution. So already on the 2nd of October, that is the day after the revolution, the People's Daily, which is the so-called mouthpiece of the party, wrote in their editorial on the ambition of the revolution that it was, among many other things, also to gradually change this backward agricultural country into a civilized and progressive industrial one. In the late 1970s, this precise goal then becomes the overarching, most important goal for the Chinese state and party. Why is that so? To use the words of Chen Yun, who is, along with Deng Xiaoping, the most important economic architect of China's reforms, he reflected in 1978 at the CCP World Conference, it has been almost 30 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, but there are still beggars. How can this be the case? If this problem of having enough to eat is not solved, the peasants might rise in rebellion and be led to the cities by local party leaders demanding food. To be sure, during the Maoist period, China had achieved major breakthroughs in public health, in public education, in the building up of basic industries, in basic industrialization, in particular in the heavy industry sector. However, the majority of Chinese people living in the countryside were still very, very poor by the late 1970s. After Mao died in 1976, Mao's designated heir, who was called Hua Guofeng, had attempted another big push industrialization, very much in the spirit of Soviet economics, trying to pursue a 10-year plan, where now the idea was that China would be importing foreign technology and foreign capital goods, and in return would be exporting oil. And through the adaptation of these advanced technologies and capital goods, would be able to very quickly grow. And through the export of oil, would be able to do so without running into a foreign payment crisis. Now, it so happened that while in the early 70s, a lot of oil was found in China, and the projections for future oil discoveries were basically based on these oil findings, this was actually a very unrealistic assumption. And when it became clear that there wasn't as much oil to be found as they had hoped, this whole model basically imploded. However, what had happened under Hua Guofeng's leadership was that Chinese delegations started to tour the world in pursuit of these foreign technologies, and found that not only had China still large challenges to overcome in terms of basic living conditions of people in the countryside, but also the neighboring East Asian countries and several European countries had by far overtaken China in ways in which they had not quite yet realized. And they also came to find that basically, as one of the leading officials, Deng Liqin, put it, there's no sign of revolution to be found anywhere abroad. So facing this challenge of poverty in the countryside, realizing just how far, in their own words, China had fallen behind these other countries, there was a realization that in light of the implosion of this last attempt at a big 10-year plan, China somehow needed a new kind of economic model in pursuit of economic development. In this context, already in 1979, Deng Xiaoping, who by then had become China's leader, said to a foreign journalist, saying that the market is limited to capitalism is wrong. Why can't socialism practice market economics? So already 1 year after the official beginning of reform and opening up, Deng Xiaoping acknowledged that in pursuit of a new kind of economic model, China would need to attribute a greater role to markets. But the question was, how could one introduce market mechanisms into the kind of command economy that was inherited from Maoism? So in that sense, there was a big ideological question around the compatibility of socialism and markets, but there was also a seemingly technical question of how to introduce market mechanisms into China's planned or command economy, which on the surface might seem like a quibble amongst economists, and maybe just a matter of tweaking a little bit in this direction or another, but turned out to be enormously consequential, since it ultimately meant the escape from shock therapy, as China was working out an alternative answer to this question of how to introduce market mechanisms. In this whole context, Deng Xiaoping famously wanted to put economics in command. During the Cultural Revolution, one of the leading slogans under Mao was that politics should be in command. And in fact, economics as an academic discipline had been largely abolished and had been branded as a bourgeois aberration. And most of China's leading economists had been sent to the countryside. Some even ended up in labor camps. And the major institutions of economic research were basically on hold during the Cultural Revolution. When reform began, these economists returned to their research institutions and their universities. However, it took some time for them to basically re-establish the economics profession. So in other words, at the same time, while economics was meant to be put in command, economics as an academic discipline was only really being recreated. Or to use Deng Xiaoping's words in a speech in January 1980, which was titled "The Present Situation and the Tasks Before Us," a good number of comrades who were shunted aside for many years haven't been back in their original positions for very long. They have lost touch with the situation. Even those who stayed at their posts all through are confronted with new problems they find hard to grasp immediately. So in other words, economics was meant to be put in command, but wasn't quite up for the task. In this context, China started to recreate market mechanisms in an experimentalist fashion and in a way that drew back to practices that had been established during the Civil War in the 1940s. We have to remember that by 1980, most of the most influential senior leaders in China were still of the revolutionary generation, of the first revolutionary generation. They had experienced the Civil War, and some of them were the key architects of the economic policies during the Civil War. I came to this realization by studying the minutes of a World Bank economist who noted in his notebook after days of meetings with Chinese counterparts, why do the Chinese answer to every question that they have to go back to the liberation period policies? This, of course, raises the question, what were the liberation period policies? And as I'm arguing in my book, the major challenge for China, for the newly born communist China in the very early years, was to overcome hyperinflation. Many thought, both on the communist side as well as on the part of American commentators and other commentators in the West, that the Chinese nationalists had basically, quote unquote, lost China as a result of being unable to bring hyperinflation under control. They had consulted with American advisors. In fact, the director of the Office of Price Administration, who was in charge of price control in the United States during World War II, also visited China and advised the nationalists on implementing a similar kind of price freeze. However, that was a pretty immediate failure, since hyperinflation was already rampant and China's economy was so disintegrated with many agricultural producers spread out in the countryside, who became more or less disconnected from markets and started to revert to subsistence agriculture, so that the money that was being circulated basically was not able to exchange against a whole lot of goods, so that the underlying breakdown of the value of money was not so much a matter of the specific kind of currency or the specific kind of price regime, but more a matter of the real lack of stuff to be exchanged against money. So what the communists had done was to organize commercial agencies that basically reintegrated markets in the countryside with the urban economy, re-established trading routes, and ensured that the producers in the countryside started to produce again for the market. And by doing that, basically ensured that their currencies could buy things in the countryside, but also that people who were getting that money in return for their agricultural produce would get urban industrial products in return, so that the value of money was to some degree reestablished. And this similar kind of logic of basically stabilizing the market through state commerce in order to stabilize the value of money was then also used in the liberation period. In this context, Chen Yun, whom I've already introduced, was one of the key architects of China's reforms, stated on April 1950, so a year after the revolution, a couple of months after the revolution, quote, "Rising prices are not good. Falling prices too are not good for production. It is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily." Now, this slogan, "It is better to be groping for stones to cross the river more steadily," has become probably the most famous slogan to characterize China's economic reform approach. And it goes back straight to 1950, straight to the idea of price stabilization, and straight to the idea of the state recreating and reintegrating markets in order for the economy to reach a more stable kind of arrangement. So all of this goes to say that these economic and political leaders who were in charge in China in the early 80s had an enormous amount of experience of creating and reintegrating markets and stabilizing prices under the most difficult conditions. These are the conditions of civil war, hyperinflation, and state building. Now, in the book, I'm taking a step back and I'm connecting these experiences of the 1940s with China's own extremely long-standing statecraft tradition. You might wonder, why would someone in a book about the 1980s bother to write a chapter about ancient Chinese economic thought? In economic history research, it's by now pretty much a standard insight that China had a very sophisticated, very advanced kind of market economy long before the arrival of Western powers. In other words, China has its own history of markets and market-state relations that has evolved quite independently from that same history in the European or American context. It is important from my perspective that this was also a history of economic thought. It was not only that China had very sophisticated market arrangements. I'm not saying they were necessarily capitalist, but they did involve very wide-ranging market activity and trading networks. That with this, there was also a lot of thinking and reflection about the question of how to govern markets and how the state should relate to market mechanisms. In particular, I think it emerges a principle of state market participation that dates back to the Guanzi, which can be dated around 300 BC. There's a whole debate around when precisely you want to date it, but I mean, very long ago, and definitely in ancient times, but which kind of resurfaces throughout Chinese history. This is not to say that there's one continuous way of thinking about state-market relations. I'm just saying there's one tradition of thought that goes back very far, that competes with other views and so on, but that we can trace through history. And this idea of state market participation basically rests on the idea that state markets can be created through states, and that states have a responsibility to stabilize markets, and through the stabilization of markets, achieve social stability. In this context, one key principle is the idea that one should be using what is heavy or important or essential to shoot at what is light or unimportant or inessential. So the idea is that if you get the essential, the most important part of the economic system, into a stable kind of arrangement, then the less important parts of the system will more or less follow. This whole idea of essential versus non-essential should sound familiar to all of us after having lived through 2 years of this pandemic, where suddenly this question of how can we ensure the continued operation of essential parts of the system has become a very central policy question. In this context, there is, from the perspective of this statecraft tradition, a need for constant empirical assessment of concrete dynamics. Since what is heavy or light, what is important or unimportant, is not simply statically given, but evolves over time and can also be situational. Heavy and light here also refers to relationships on the market. So something becomes light if it is overabundant and becomes heavy when it is in short supply. So all of this goes to say that in the 1980s, when Chinese leaders and economists were thinking about the question of how to recreate markets, they were drawing on a very long history of institutional arrangements that involved state market creation and state market participation. And that this reservoir of institutional legacies also played a role in the 1940s and played a role in the context of the liberation policies. So back to the 1970s, late 1970s, where the first and foremost question in the very early years of reform was how to go about agricultural reform. At the time, China was, of course, still a very predominantly agricultural economy. And there was also a general recognition that there needed to be a shift away from an emphasis on industrializing first towards an emphasis on developing the countryside and developing agriculture first in order to release resources that could then feed into industrialization. During the Maoist period, industrialization had also been basically financed through surpluses or more than surpluses from the countryside, where there was a so-called price scissors, which means that the price for agricultural goods was set relatively low in comparison to the price for industrial goods, which meant that if people producing in the countryside were, through the design of prices, getting less in return for their product than what they were putting into their product in terms of labor, effort, and other costs, there was a constant net flow of resources from the countryside to the urban industrial economy. From the perspective of the institutional arrangement, we can broadly speaking think of the countryside as being organized in people's communes, where each of these people's communes had to deliver a grain quota to the national grain system at a state set price, which in other words meant that they got an amount of money in return for the grain that they were delivering, whereas the national grain system would then provide the urban economies with the grain and other basic agricultural resources that they would need. The first thing that happened in the agricultural reforms was basically a bottom-up initiative on the part of some agricultural communes that suggested that it would be preferable for them to produce based on the so-called household responsibility system, where each household would be subcontracting their share in the grain quota that the commune had to deliver to the national grain system. And if they would be able to produce more than their share in the quota, this would then basically be on their own accounts. In other words, they would gain personally or as a household if they could produce more than their share in the quota. This kind of scheme was initially tolerated from the center, in particular in those localities that had been very poor localities and that did not play a major role for the national grain system, that were, if you want, so non-essential for the national grain system because they only delivered very small quotas to begin with, or some of them even ended up being net receivers of grain and other agricultural goods transfers. So this so-called dual track system then created a situation where next to the plan, there were market relationships emerging for the production of the households that went beyond their share in the quota. So in other words, there was an emergence of peripheral exchange relations, which for the local part was more or less spontaneous and organized by individuals. For the trans-regional part, often also involved an important role for commercial agencies on the part of the state, where parts of the agencies that previously simply managed grain quotas now also started to become some sort of traders that bought some parts of the surpluses and would sell them somewhere else. In sum, this resulted in, as I've already mentioned, a dual track system of production for the quota and for the plan, and production for the market happening at the same time under two different prices, a plan price and a market price. Eventually, the system spread throughout China, and the dual track price system really became the backbone of the agricultural reforms. The agricultural reforms were so spectacularly successful in terms of increasing grain output very fast that by 1984, people considered the problem of national grain production as solved. And this was incredibly important for industrial reform, since it created a certain space in terms of resources that were flowing out of the agricultural economy. In the creation of the agricultural reforms, the so-called, what I'm here calling dual track market reformers, played a critical role. This was basically an eclectic group of young reform intellectuals, most of whom had spent their youth in the countryside during the Cultural Revolution. They were urban youth, but were sent to the countryside under this movement during the Cultural Revolution. And when they returned to the cities in the late 1970s, most of them to enter universities, they continued to be dedicated to the agricultural question, since during their time in the countryside, they had already been reading all sorts of Marxist classics, Maoist writings, and so on, trying to understand how the political economy of agriculture could be reformed in order to lay the foundations for greater economic prosperity in China. They formed an alliance with an older generation of leaders of the kind of generation that I've described in relation to the Civil War, and basically became jointly the intellectual backbone of the agricultural reforms, where they went out and did survey research on these bottom-up initiatives on household responsibility systems, and then systematized the experiences on the ground and helped to translate these bottom-up initiatives into national policy. Later on, as this group was becoming an important force in China's market reform debate, they also conducted empirical studies across China in state-owned enterprises and in the urban industrial economy more broadly, interviewing consumers and all of that. They also did survey research in Hungary and Yugoslavia. They even did a trip to Latin America. Some of them also went to Japan, and some of them also went to West Germany, since the West German price reform became an important reference point in China's price reform debate, which I will get to in a minute. So from the agricultural reforms, then eventually the question became how to go about economic system reform in the urban industrial economy. In a very stylized fashion, and certainly simplified, we can think of the urban industrial economy as having been constructed based on the idea of one big national workshop. Now, as it is the case with all ideals, reality typically diverges from ideals, and whereas this model, that I will explain in a minute, makes it look as if there was a clean, complete planned economy. In reality, there were all sorts of market and informal activities happening at the margins of the system. And in some sense, these informal activities might have enabled the survival of the system. However, the basic structures of the system were constructed in a way where the idea was that each socialist production unit would be delivering their output to the next socialist production unit, and that in return for the delivery of their output, they would get a state set price. And for the inputs that were assigned to them, they would have to pay a state set price. On the surface, this then makes it seem as if prices were simply a shadow operation, simply an accounting operation that didn't really matter, since the production decisions were dictated by the plan and the availability of inputs was dictated by the mechanisms of command and order. However, prices did perform an important role in being set in a way that facilitated redistribution across different parts of the economy. Just like was the case between the agricultural and the industrial price, where the low agricultural price facilitated the flowing out of resources from the countryside into the urban economy, there was, to some degree, a redistribution happening between sectors. In particular, in essential so-called luxury goods, think of stuff like radios, wristwatches, sewing machines, and so on, were priced relatively highly. This was a way to extract liquidity from households. And on the other hand, raw materials and the most upstream, most essential production goods were priced relatively low as a way to basically subsidize and encourage more downstream industries. These low, heavy industry prices and this essential heavy industry production was also the most controlled, most tightly state controlled part of the economy, so that you did not only have prices that were not simply a reflection of costs, but that you also had different degrees of state control across the system, with the highest degree of state control in the most upstream parts of the system and lower degrees of central state control in more downstream parts. So the question then was, if this is your starting point, how would you be reintroducing market mechanisms into such an economy? During some undergraduate lectures, I have actually broken up students into groups and have asked them to come up with solutions. It's a pretty difficult problem. What happened in practice was that as a result of the success of the agricultural reforms, markets that were emerging in the countryside were also connecting to the urban industrial economy. In other words, those in the countryside that were producing more than they had to produce for the quota and were selling some of the output on the market and were generating cash in return, wanted to use this cash to buy stuff like radios, bicycle, wristwatches, and sewing machines. So there now was a market demand for consumer goods, which very quickly resulted in the emergence of market production on the part of these production units, initially basically in a gray zone.
10 minutes.
Yes. As the countryside also started to develop more and more township and village enterprises, in other words, as the market production on the part of the rural households moved from simply producing agricultural goods into producing simple light industry goods, there was also increasingly a demand for upstream industrial goods. So in other words, a second market track was emerging more or less endogenously in the urban industrial economy. The question then was, should this market track be fostered, developed, and systematized, or should it be suppressed and some other form of reform approach pursued? In this context, these young reform intellectuals that I've mentioned played an important role They summoned researchers from across the whole country at the so-called Morganshan Youth Conference, and at this youth conference discussed the question of economic system reform, in particular the question of price reform, and came to argue that this dual track reform system that was emerging more or less spontaneously could be systematized into China's reform approach. In fact, the dual track system became national policy in 1985, and Zhao Ziyang, who was then Prime Minister of China and who was one of the most important political leaders of reform in the first decade, he was later imprisoned in the context of June 4th, 1989, and spent the rest of his life in prison. So as a result of this, his legacy is very contested. But I think based on my research, there can be little doubt that he was absolutely instrumental for the economic reforms in the 80s. So he summarized the dual track reform to local cadres who were meant to implement this policy. And he said this policy would be composed of 4 elements. It would be composed of letting go of small commodities. The state should no longer control non-essential parts of the economy. The price management system for important commodities should be reformed, and the prices of important goods should be adjusted carefully in small steps. But fourthly, the state also had a responsibility to participate in the market, as Zhao Ziyang put it. After having enlivened prices by letting them go, the state had to participate in the market to regulate the prices as in the first years after liberation. For sectors where prices were allowed to fluctuate on the market, the range of the fluctuations should be limited by market participation. This meant that the state should have stocks to be able to add supplies to the market when the price was rising too high, and purchase when the price was falling too low. In other words, the state market participation became a key mechanism of China's market reforms. This whole approach was challenged by the so-called package reformers, who pursued a very similar intellectual agenda to that which came later to be called shock therapy in the Eastern European context. They did not call it shock therapy, but the intellectual parallels abound. The members of this group were predominantly middle-aged established intellectuals who often had a background in orthodox socialist economics of the Soviet type. They were also the first to study in the United States and England, and they were joined by young scientists and engineers. There was a whole connection with Eastern Europe, but also with monetarists and straight-out neoliberals like Milton Friedman, which I'm happy to comment on in more detail during the Q&A. I will skip over this and go straight into their arguments. So they criticized the dual track system as creating friction and contradiction, since each of the officials in charge of one of these production units would now be facing 2 kinds of prices, a low plan price and a high market price, which would create incentives for rent seeking and corruption, since they would benefit personally if they channeled resources out of the plan, which was, of course, an incredibly important critique, and a critique that had a lot of resonance with the problems that were emerging with the dual track price system. So they argued that China should impose tight fiscal and monetary control, adjust the prices by planning, and then in the next step, let go of all prices. Importantly, let go of the core of the prices in the most upstream, most essential industries, and replace market participation by the state with indirect macro control. So this was basically the idea of a Big Bang. Those on the side of the dual track argued that the Big Bang causes cost push inflation, since the prices in the upstream industries were by design set too low in the pre-reform system, which meant that they were bound to shoot up, and that these increasing prices in the upstream system would then be handed down to the next production unit. Since each of these production units were still socialist production units, they did not have a tight budget constraints. They were not capitalist enterprises of any sort. So what would be happening would be that these price increases would simply be spiraling through the system, and that this kind of upward spiral in prices and eventually also wage price spiral could not be contained by macroeconomic control. This might sound familiar in the current context. So they then argued that the state should keep control of the backbone of the urban industrial economy. It could let go of prices of inessential goods, but the key question of the debate was really whether or not the state should let go of the most essential, most upstream parts of the economy. In 1986, China came very close to implementing such a big bang. At that time, a study tour in Hungary and Yugoslavia sent back telegrams to Premier Jiang Zemin, warning that previous attempts at price liberalization in Hungary and Yugoslavia had been highly inflationary, and that this would have the potential to undermine the kind of economic stability that China needed in order to pursue further economic reforms. This plan was then stopped by Premier Jiang Zemin, who himself had initially established this plan. In 1988, as the dual track price system itself was creating more and more tensions within China's economy and society, Deng Xiaoping stepped up and himself took the initiative for a form of Big Bang, which was then, however, stopped when, in reaction to the Politburo's announcement that it had in principle passed a plan for price and wage reform, people started buying up all sorts of durable goods that they could get hold of, withdraw their savings from the bank, so proper bank runs, and basically a pretty far-reaching form of social unrest and panic that, because everybody was withdrawing their savings and running after whatever they could buy, then also created a spike in inflation. And the situation became so bad that the leadership decided to revert the attempt at this comprehensive price reform, and in fact stall reform for the time being, where this whole meltdown in 1988 is an important context to what happened in 1989. This is here Milton Friedman making again an appearance in 1988, once more trying to argue for price liberalization. But by 1988, at the time when he came in the fall of 88, the political situation had become so tense that the window of opportunity for such an advice had closed.
We're almost out of time.
Yes. So in conclusion, I think we can say that there were two competing logics. The logic of the Big Bang, which departs from comparative statics, from a stylized model of the old system, and a theoretically derived target model, where reform is thought of as a shock that facilitates the transition from one static state to the other. Complete markets are thought of as a reform target, whereas this reform target is meant to be achieved by destroying the plan. In contrast, the logic of the dual track price system is one of starting from an analysis of prevailing economic forces and institutions in order to identify ways to create a new kind of reform dynamic, initially at the margins of the system, but as this new dynamic is taking hold, eventually transform the economy as a whole. In this context, then, market forces are a means in a larger transformation process which need to be guided by the state. While China escaped the shock therapy in the 1980s, I think a tension between these two reform approaches prevailed throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and in some sense until very recently. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Isabella. That was really wonderful. And I know that I pushed you a little bit at the end. This is fascinating stuff. Andrew, please, the screen is yours.
Okay, well, thanks so much. I'm honored actually to be invited to be a discussant for Isabella's presentation because it's such fantastic work. I mean, I have to say that I've been, just watching you over the last few years just rise up to fame has been quite impressive, and I think it's entirely deserved. You know, it's the book is fantastic. Everyone should read it, and it's a wonderfully written book. It's dense. You won't read it in a night, but but it's you learn so much from it. I've been immensely enriched by it, and definitely I would say that those who might dare tweet about you should definitely read it before they say anything, because otherwise they're just putting their foot in their mouths and so on. But no more on that. And yeah, it's and also even just your presentation now, it's amazing just to see how you could wrap up almost entirely the book in 1 hour, which is quite impressive too. A bit of a lesson for me who has a hard time wrapping up one article in an hour. But obviously my job here is to, as discussant, is to stimulate discussion and debate. So, and I have very little time for that. So I'll get to the point. And so if I would just focus on maybe 3 points. Of course, I have a hard time finding points to really challenge because I enjoyed it so much. And also there's some things that for me in my own research are really rich, like one of the sort of protagonists of your story is Wang Xiaoqiang. He actually pops up in a lot of my research on early regional development in Western China, because he also wrote an important book by Bei Nangfeng on the poverty of plenty, which actually is more of a sort of perhaps a bit of, one might say in today's language, a colonialist view on the Western minority regions. And it'd be really interesting to discuss with you more about that, given that you've read his work in so much detail. But besides that, 3 points I'd focus on for discussion perhaps. One is there's sort of a silence in your book, especially given that this is a gathering of development studies, development economics. There's a silence in your book between the poles of the Chinese intellectual traditions and the mainstream economic traditions, between the whole. Of course, there's a discussion of the Soviet debates and so on, but development economics, early development economics, the classics of development economics, where does that lie? The second is also on the notion of gradual change, I'd just like to get into. And the third, even though your book is not about Russia, you still do frame the beginning of it with the comparison of China and Russia, and it can probably be a big takeaway point that a lot of people will take. So just a few comments on that. And on the first point, your discussion of the Guanzi system, of course, in ancient China was fascinating. And the way you connect that to the present and how it influences ways of thinking. But one thing that really struck me in reading that, and maybe it's just lack of space in the book and you've already thought about this and have things planned for the future. But for me, the obvious comparison in that whole lineage of thinking would be to the early modern mercantilist thinking in Europe, where you have the very similar concerns about the role of statecraft, the role of managing monopolies, the role of managing prices and creating markets to build up national strength and a sort of imperial rivalries and so on. And what strikes me is that there's a lot of commonality there. If you can contrast the ancient Chinese thinking to modern neoclassical economics, you're like, okay, well, two different worlds. But if you compare it to mercantilist thinking in Europe, leading right up to Adam Smith, who was also a bit of a late mercantilist author, you find a lot of interesting comparisons there. And of course, what one of the authors there we could turn to, of course, is Rigi's book on Adam Smith in Beijing, which I don't necessarily agree with his analysis of China, but his discussion of Adam Smith, of course, in that book is fascinating. And also in that respect, I also just wonder, and perhaps in your research you've come across it, is to what degree was there a presence in this whole development of intellectual thinking in China around reform, both in the 50s and in the 80s, of classical development economics, particularly some of the pioneers of classical development economics being from the global south, as we call it today, or the third world non-aligned movement, which China was involved in, or were socialist thinkers for that matter. I know, for instance, Arthur Lewis, especially in the 2000s, starts to become a major reference point in Chinese discussions about what's happening with the labor market. And presumably in the 50s, economists would have been aware of him as well then. The debates about balanced versus unbalanced growth that were occurring between Rosenstein, Roden, and Hirschman, for instance. Did those have any presence and influence on the development of these Chinese economists? And also, I mean, Eric Halleiner's work, for instance, he points out even how Sun Yat-sen was an early development thinker in that sense, a pioneer very much. And so that thinking around development was very much present. And I'm just wondering, there are probably other plural sources of economic development thinking that were influencing the Chinese leadership and Chinese intellectuals and Chinese economists, other than the mainstream Western and the ancient Chinese and perhaps the Soviet model as well. Although, of course, the Soviet discussion of development is very much interlinked with a lot of the early development thinking. So that's one point. This was kind of a question to you because I'm curious about that. The second one is on the notion of gradualism, because this is one thing that's always struck me or bothered me, is that, as you say, probably one of the most famous quotes is this idea of crossing the river, feeling the stones. It's sort of like almost. It's the other quote that's probably almost as prominent is when Zhou Enlai says, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And he says it's too early to tell. And of course, he was talking about the '68 revolution, not the 1768 revolution. But anyways, that's another story. But it's almost like these sayings that take on a foundational role in certain ideologies, whether or not they are actually accurate representations of what happened. And because what really strikes me in the Chinese, all of these developments, the reform period, the early reform period that you're discussing, is actually how radical it was, right? How fast the changes were, which you actually even document in your book. You don't foreground it so much in your book. And you actually clarify this on page, I think it was page 140. I had it in my notes, I can't find it. Page 140 something another, where you clarify that you talk about the planned gradualism versus the experimental gradualism. And then you clarify that the gradualism wasn't about the pace. It was about taking steps rather than wholesale big bang type ideas. Yet nonetheless, the pace, when we look at what was happening at the time, was extremely fast, right? So like, for instance, in one of your footnotes, you cite, I think you were citing Peter Nolan's work on this, where the household contracting had risen from 31% of production units in 1981 to 94% in 1983. That was basically almost two-thirds of the rural population in the space of 2 years shifted to this model, right? You also saw in the same period fiscal reforms, basically the whole, the local states being able to keep their own fiscal resources. Within a short space of time, just suddenly the whole fiscal redistributive system had collapsed, and provinces, Western and Central provinces, which I've done a lot of my work on, which were reliant on subsidies, fell into stagnation because all of a sudden their subsidies collapsed, right? So you also saw the collapse of the rural health system. And even if the price reform, as you say, was gradual, it was still extremely rapid, as you just showed in some of your figures there, or in the beginning of your book. And of course, the balance of payments was one thing you mentioned, the balance of payments in the 70s, but in the 80s, of course, the trade deficit sank to under 4% of GDP by 1985, which is probably a major underlying concern that was informing a lot of the decision making. And so it's and I'm sure you would agree with me on all of this, but it's just the messaging about gradualism. I always find it to be a tricky one, because it could encourage an interpretation of the Chinese experience as sort of discouraging ambitious planning for development, the sort of the developmentalist big grand plans, whereas actually the Chinese example was very much that, right? That while we could characterize certain aspects of gradualism in the sense of not wholesale bang, but a very quick stepping, it's nonetheless extremely big, large scale, ambitious projects that they were undertaking in extremely short periods of time. And that just leads to my third point in the comparison with Russia, and I'll wrap up quickly because I'm sure I've gone over time already, is this in that sense as well. In the comparison of Russia, I often find it a bit tricky in the sense that they're obviously offset by a decade, right? And I even wonder to what extent where China ended up by the late 80s, which you describe in chapter 8 in some detail, might have even sort of given the message, given the signs that their gradualism to a certain degree failed, right? I mean, even it's interesting, Robert Allen in his recent American Economic Review article where he does the cost of basic needs approach to measuring poverty. Actually, it's quite interesting in there because in contrast to the World Bank $1.9 a day PPP poverty line, where he does he does a poverty line with linear programming on cost of basic needs, you actually just see in the late 80s and 90s this sharp increase in poverty rates in China that only then starts to decline in the mid 90s. And the impact, especially from the mid 80s onwards, was actually quite severe, right? You had the big trade deficit, you had inflation, which you talk about, you had rural stagnation, you had rising poverty in this context and so on. And actually that example might well have actually reinforced the messaging to the Russians when looking at their options. I'm not saying that, Big Bang was any better, but that actually the Chinese example in that sense wasn't necessarily by the end of the 80s necessarily giving a good example. And it just raises a point that Wang Xiaohua, in New Left Review 2015, wrote this excellent critique of Perry Anderson's discussion of the Russian and Chinese Revolution. And she makes the point whereas in Russia, they politically liberalized before economically liberalizing. No, sorry, the other way. Political liberalization preceded economic liberalization. On one hand, the economy collapsed, but at the same time, there was the preservation of sort of universalistic social security and social policy that nonetheless sustained, of course, an extremely different urban industrial context, sustained people's quality of life much more than China, where because they economically liberalized and eventually didn't even politically liberalize, the economy took off, but universal healthcare collapsed. There was a lot of trauma for a lot of people, and she makes the point that a lot of this is often doesn't receive any emphasis in this whole discussion, and the degree to which actually we have to take this into consideration. And I think you do actually. When I got to chapter 8, I was. You do get into that, but I think it probably in that whole story of the China-Russian comparison, especially in terms of its temporal continuity, going from, because of course, Jeffrey Sachs only rose to fame in the late 80s already, and the option of Jeffrey Sachs style Big Bang wasn't really an option until the late 80s, early 90s in any case, right? So, but the Chinese experience probably fed into that and that perspective. And your thoughts on that anyways, but these were just 3 issues that I wanted to raise reading your book that triggered my thoughts in terms of comments I can make in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. It's a fantastic book and everyone I think should read it.
Thanks, Andrew. And we need to have you back to give a talk as well. Sure. We'll bring you back into this discussion. Isabella, I don't know if you want to very quickly respond. We're already getting a lot of questions, or go straight to questions and respond to some of what Andrew said as you answer them.
Maybe I'll try to very quickly respond,
Okay.
Which is virtually impossible.
Yes, those are some big questions.
Let me just very quickly just say a quick few words, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So on the question of colonialist view towards the Western regions, I think it's important to keep in mind that all of this idea of economic system reform is very much from the perspective of redesigning the whole system in the name of the system, right? And this is the case on both sides of this debate. So in that sense, I see this as not necessarily being inconsistent with this kind of view of the Western regions, because from that perspective, it is very much from the perspective of power in the center of Beijing. On the question of the early mercantilists, I think Eric Helleiner's latest book is fabulous, and he's engaging with some of the same Chinese thinkers as me and the mercantilist thinkers. So I think this is just a shout out to Eric. But substantively, I think one key difference between the early mercantilists and people texts like the Guanzi is that the early mercantilists, of course, have a state-driven, outward-oriented project. And the project of the Guanzi is to create or try to create a stable arrangement of markets and states internally that is also meant to finance war externally, but the state market participation is focused on the domestic economy rather than on the outward drive of colonial enterprises such as the East India Company. On the notion of gradualism, I agree with everything that you have said. I just want to make one very quick comment. Yes, gradualism can be extremely radical and fast. And I think that the agricultural reforms is the best example. As Wang Xiaoqiang was actually saying in our interview, people say the agricultural reforms were gradualist. The People's Commune was the backbone of the Maoist economy, and it was abolished within the span of only 2-3 years. So this is the most radical kind of institutional reorganization that you can imagine from the perspective of the institution of the People's Commune, which, as he is arguing, was, by the way, also very fundamental political reform, since this was also the backbone of the political organization of the system. So this whole idea of political reform, political liberalization being absent in China and being present in Russia, I think is based on a very narrow definition of what political reform means. Because if you take the organization, the political organization of the countryside seriously, then there was, I mean, you may like it or not, it's not necessarily political reform in the sense of democratization, but it's still a very fundamental political reorganization. Yes, I think that Chinese gradualism has to be thought of as the unleashing of new dynamics. And this unleashing of new dynamics, as I've tried to argue, can become extremely powerful in ways that transforms the core in a very fast way. But the thing is that you start from unleashing new dynamics at the margins. In the first instance, you don't abolish the People's Commune. Only once this whole market dynamic takes hold, you abolish the People's Commune, which is the opposite of saying start by abolishing the People's Commune. And this kind of gradualism, this unleashing of new dynamics, is always in the context of extremely bold, extremely ambitious, extremely long-term projects that take a very vague and unclear form to begin with, and that are then specified as these new dynamics are being channeled into certain directions. Okay, I'll just leave it at that, which I know is not answering all your points, but just as a quick reaction.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for these generous and thoughtful comments. I should have, of course, started with that. I tried to be quick.
I know I'm rushing both of you along, but we do have questions flowing in from the students, which is making me bite my tongue in relationship to my own questions, which I can come back to if there's time. So I want to call on Elena Dahlem, then Gino Debo. Gino Debo is an alumnus of ours, and I think joining us from Brussels, and Laura Mann, our colleague here at the LSE. So, Elena.
Hi, I'm a current LSE student in the Department of International History. And my question concerns the relevance of South-South cooperation. So I'm wondering, how important was South-South cooperation in the early days of Chinese development in the late 1970s and 1980s? And what potential do you think South-South cooperation offers for China's and other countries' future development?
Thank you. And Gino?
Hello, good evening. I tried to start the video, but it doesn't work.
That's
But
okay, Gino.
yes. So my question is, ideologically, how does the Chinese Communist Party explain inequality? Thank you.
Thanks, Gino. And Laura.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for an interesting talk, and I'm waiting for your book to arrive in the post. So I'm looking forward very much to read it. So my question is about the kind of domestic economists in China. And if you could talk a little bit about how the state tried to shape their career incentives, maybe perhaps especially in terms of how do you progress as an economist in China within academia? Are there attempts to shape the kinds of journals that they publish in? Other criteria around getting jobs and promotion? And maybe if you could talk about how that has changed over time, whether they're being pulled towards kind of Western career incentives. Thank you very much.
Great questions. So, Isabella.
Okay, thank you for a great set of questions. On the South-South cooperation, I think the main change in the reform period is a giving up on the ideas of the Bandung Conference and the ideas that basically the non-aligned movement is kind of the backbone of development, and the South-South solidarity is the key of China's foreign policy. I mean, we have to remember that even as far as I know, during the Mao period, when China was still a very, very poor country, there were a lot of net transfers into other developing countries, right? So in that sense, this used to be really a backbone of the Maoist development model, if you want to speak of a development model. And then basically in the late 70s, I mean, with the very short China-Vietnam War, with the reorientation to the US in the early 70s, and basically, I mean, quite literally in relation to the UN, China's claim to have a seat at the table, right? But then also quite quickly, the urge to have a seat at the table of global capitalism, if you want. So I think resides in a situation where the South-South cooperation becomes a less central concern, and then eventually, of course, takes on a very different form in more recent years. Compared to the Maoist era of that history. So in that sense, there's a very fundamental rearrangement of the relationship between China and the global South. And that in many ways is an expression of the primacy of economic development within China as a national project of development that is meant to utilize the reintegration into global capitalism and the reintegration into the existing hierarchies of global capitalism as they presented itself with the US at the top in the 80s. On the question of the ideological explanation of inequality, I'll take a slightly circumvented approach to that question, which allows me to fill in one part that I skipped over, which is part of what enabled ideologically the opening for remarketization, if you want so, was the argument that China during the Cultural Revolution had basically overstepped its ambitions in terms of socialist organization, or in Marxist language, had revolutionized the social relations of productions too much beyond what was adequate for the stage of development of the economic forces of production, which then would have created a basic contradiction between two socialist social relations and two backward forces of production, which forced, in this reform logic, China to take a step back and to revert to a primary stage of socialism. And in this primary stage of socialism, one of the main tasks of China would be in this logic of reform ideology, that China had to make up lessons from capitalism and would have to give up its overly equal kind of political organization, that it should not be the egalitarianism of the poor, but that it should be some becoming rich first. This was at the time very explicitly also an onslaught of the idea of common prosperity. So the return of this whole idea of common prosperity in this as this like centrist slogan actually goes back to this 80s discussions where common prosperity was seen as something that would need to be achieved at a later stage of development, and that in the first instance, China had to release individual forces of production by letting some get rich first. And in many ways, I think that the inequality that was created through this was inherent in the kind of reform approach that China pursued, and that the question whether some are allowed to get rich first, I mean, implied that others should be getting rich later, right? Was kind of a tension that has been in the background for a long time, and that has been struggled over within China, and that is still being thought about in relation to the question of what does common prosperity exactly mean? Does this just mean that we want to be a little bit less unequal? Does this mean that we want to strengthen the rights of workers? Does this mean that we just want to increase the labor share through some technocratic means? Does this mean that we just want to have a little bit fairer taxation system? Or does this mean something much more fundamental now or at some point in the future, right? So in that sense, this is an excellent question, and I think an extremely relevant question right now in the year 2022. On the question of domestic economists, this is again a great question that allows me to clarify some things that I had to skip over. So many of the people on the side of the dual track reform were not necessarily formally economists. In fact, when they started to burst on the scene, someone like Wang Xiaoqiang, when he started to become one of the leaders of the rural development group, he was not even a party member yet. And this is absolutely extraordinary in a socialist country at the time, to have someone who's not a member of the party become one of the leaders of a research group that ends up advising the central leadership on one of the most fundamental questions of reform, right? So you get this. And then eventually they found the Economic System Reform Research Institute, which is considered as the first think tank in the socialist world. I don't know if this is true. This is what the Chinese claim. I don't know if this is true in comparison to Eastern Europe or Russia. I have no idea. But from the perspective of the Chinese economists, this was absolutely groundbreaking, because it was the creation of an institution that was charged with economic policy research, and that was not part of the regular hierarchies of the Academy of Social Sciences, of the official, of the party school, of the universities, and so on. So this was an institution that was supported by the system, but also got funds from, for example, George Soros at some point, and was at the same time plugged into the system, right? So this, I think, is a component that is not to be underestimated in these early years of reform, because you kind of have this intellectual policy force that is at the same time inside and outside of the system. After 89, most of these, whom I'm calling broadly young reform intellectuals, I mean, they are not that terribly young anymore, but that point, ended up, I mean, the key organizations of this reform movement ended up standing in solidarity with the protesters on Tiananmen Square, which meant that basically not all, but most of these people were actually expelled or kind of basically fled the country on very short notice. And some of them even ended up in prison. I mean, for example, Bainan Feng, whom Andrew had mentioned and whom I've interviewed many days, he spent many years in prison. So, and some of them then after, either kind of flying under the radar or actually literally ending up in prison, entered private business, so-called xiahai, right? They left the system and became businessmen. Some others went abroad and then kind of came back when the tides had flattened, and some of them still became researchers or still have positions within the research systems. Others have more marginal positions. This is like just the story of this reform group. In terms of the economics profession itself, there has been a very, very fundamental reorganization of the economics profession. The economics profession today in China is very, very overwhelmingly neoclassical. There are some UMass graduates, to show some UMass pride here, who have positions at very good universities in China. And very recently, there are some new initiatives towards having, strengthening the schools of Marxism. And then I've heard from Chinese colleagues that some of the top Chinese economics journals also very recently have published again some things that mention Marx, and that some of the mainstream economists actually start mentioning Marx in some way, just to kind of add some backing in that direction. But by and large, I think it's fair to say that the economics discipline has really been completely remodeled based on the American example. And Steve Cohn's book, Shifting Economic Paradigms in China, I'm not sure if this is a precise title, is a very good account of exactly that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Andrew, if you don't mind, I'm going to let the next three questions come on the table, and then I'll let you answer first.
Okay.
And you can pick up on any of what you wanted to say in relationship to this last round.
Sure.
And then we can turn to Isabella, because I think we'll be nearing our conclusion, but we'll see. So with that in mind, I want to call on, first of all, Blair Nung, who is actually viewing from our Marshall building, so she can't speak up. So I'll read out her question. And then I'm going to go to Marie. I think we need to read them all. So rather than listen to me, Greta, would you like to read them?
I can read this because there are students that we teach that I've seen all week. So Blair is asking, given the inflation figures seen recently all over the world, is it wise to focus only on central banks managing interest rates? Is anything missing from the mainstream views about the rising price, in your opinion? Then Marie is asking, which are the most important lessons we can learn from China's experience for development strategies today? And then we have a question from YouTube from Anthony, who kind of contextualizes it in Jeffrey Sachs' statement or admission that he was wrong to push big bang reforms on the Soviet bloc, and is asking whether Russia, Poland, etc. would have avoided a large GDP drop and high suicide/alcohol rates in the early 1990s if they went dual track. Those are our three questions.
Okay, thank you. So Andrew, I'll let you talk first this time. And then
okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I'm not on mute, so that's good. I want to save most of the time for Isabella because it's really her lecture. But on the previous questions, I was just going to say that in terms of the South-South cooperation, even though there has been this change, even today, the state still sort of justifies or argues or frames a lot of its aid programs in terms of the continuity of South-South cooperation since the Bandung years in the 60s and so on. It's an important part of their narrative. Obviously, it's transformed massively, especially in the last 10 years or so. And on the inequality question, I find what's so interesting as well is that, inequality, basically, I think, at least in terms of the Gini, peaked around 2010, 2009, 2010, 11. And, the state has been very consciously, exactly as Isabella says, the to what degree does shared prosperity just mean it's sort of like an aspiration to at one point maybe bring down inequality a bit more. But so much of the challenges of bringing down inequality are still the institutional leftovers of attempts to reforming the system that she's talking about in the 80s, whether it's like the distribution between fiscal resources between the center and local governments, or whether it's urban rural types of divisions, financing of healthcare, which is a huge aspect of inequality, and other things are all still, I mean, despite the radical nature of the changes, there's still institutional legacies that are still, that the government has to solve these things to a certain degree to be able to really get to the core of a lot of inequality issues. And which is why I think makes your work so interesting to reflect on this. In terms of career, I remember hearing, in terms of this fact that Wang Xiaoqiang, for instance, was not a party member, that was particular to the 80s, wasn't it? I think the 80s and 90s, you had this where non-party members could actually find themselves in positions of power. The interesting thing today is that doesn't exist anymore. Anyone in a position of power is categorically a party member in that sense. So it was almost interesting how there was almost more openness in that sense in the 80s than there is now. I'll leave the inflation question to you because you're the expert on that. In terms of Jeffrey Sachs, well, definitely, I think, yeah, Big Bang was ridiculous. But in terms of China's development experiences, one thing I do find fascinating is throughout this entire period, from the Maoist period right up to the present, China has maintained control over its financial system, and it's basically its banks are mostly nationally owned and mostly state-owned, whether it's at the central, provincial, or city level, which means that even today its financial system can be used. Almost the entire financial system as a developmental bank, rather than having a developmental bank that has to function like a private bank, like in the case of the BNDES in Brazil. They kept this. I think this is so important throughout this whole process, is that maintaining, Samir Amin used to like to define China as still being socialist on the basis of state ownership of the financial system and state ownership of land. Whether that makes you socialist or not is a different question. But I think definitely in terms of their ability to navigate through this extremely volatile processes of change, these aspects have been crucial. And I mean, we could talk about so many other things as well, but I'll pass it on to Isabella.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, maybe just re-emphasizing what you said, urban-rural inequality is absolutely important, and I forgot to mention that. And that, of course, also comes along with the extremely large numbers of migrant workers, which kind of questions the success of agricultural reform in the long run, right? As one of my interviewees was saying, like, what is the success of agricultural reform if 2-3 decades later you have 250 million people who are migrant workers and second-class citizens internally, right? So there is a big question mark there, which you don't see if you look just from the perspective of the first years of reform. On the opening, yeah, I just want to re-emphasize, yes, absolutely, everything that I said in that relation is about the 80s. And as, again, many of my interview partners were emphasizing, the 80s was this like moment of extreme openness that was very unusual, because it was this like genuine openness, which is what I'm trying to show in the book. I mean, things could have gone differently, right? There was a genuine debate over where to go. By now, like in some sense, the mist has settled. The system is very much consolidated and hierarchical and working in a certain way that by no means has the kind of openness that was there in the 80s, and both in terms of instability as well as in terms of rigidness, I'd say. Okay, on the inflation question, yeah, so much to unpack there. In relation to China, let me just re-emphasize what Andrew already said and add to the aspect of the financial system that China, of course, also has a very complex system of state-owned enterprises that tend to act counter-cyclically. So they invest during a downswing and they withhold investment during an upswing, which means that they have basically industry-specific counter-cyclical policies, where in the West, we only have at best counter-cyclical policies. I mean, since 2008, counter-cyclical policies on the macro level seem to be okay again. But I mean, there was a period when we didn't even have counter-cyclical policies on the macro level, right? So this is like as far apart as you can be, or in one case, you basically stabilize the fluctuations in specific markets through investment, and in some cases also through state buffer stocks. And in the other case, you only stabilize through contracting or expanding fiscal expansion. Now, this of course, fiscal spending, this of course has implications for price stability, because if you can steer your macroeconomic cycles in such a very fine-grained way, then you can also work towards greater price stability. And in fact, what we see in China is that frequently, when prices of specific goods are shooting up in extreme ways, you get the state step in very targeted fashion. So for example, the pork price was increasing quite dramatically when China was struggling with swine fever. And the price of pork became a topic that was repeatedly in Li Keqiang's, in the prime minister's speeches. And China basically mobilized its state-owned enterprises to import, and its state trading agencies to import more pork, released pork from frozen pork buffer stocks that the state is holding, and then initiated all sorts of policies that were meant to enable the private producers to increase the production of pork more quickly than they would be if they were left to their own devices. So in other words, you have a price spike that affects the CPI very heavily, because pork is a big share in consumer spending. And the state steps in by increasing in a targeted fashion with a whole range of instruments the specific supply of pork in order to bring down the price of pork and thereby stabilize the consumer price index. Now, more broadly speaking, what we are facing right now, I think, is a kind of inflation that is quite different from other inflations that might come to mind when thinking about inflation. Now, macroeconomists, when they try to come up with policy responses to inflation, they typically say the first thing that you should do is to increase the interest rate, right? Now, the problem right now, I think, is that the inflation that we have is one that is in large parts driven by bottlenecks, where these bottlenecks basically, just like with the swine fever case and the price of pork, create the spiking up of specific prices. Now, if specific important prices are spiking up, this then increases the cost for other producers, and these producers at times only pass on these price increases, and at other times they actually increase their profit margins and pass on more than the increase in prices that they are facing in terms of costs, which is something that has been happening. This has been documented by all sorts of organizations, including the Bundesbank, the German central bank, which is known to be extremely conservative institution. So this is a real concern. And the question is, can you contain these kind of price increases that are driven by the increases of specific prices that result from specific markets being out of balance because of the pandemic, and this balance not easily being restored because of bottlenecks and real physical barriers to the increase in supply? Can you tackle these kind of price increases with interest rate hikes? To some degree, yes, if you bring down demand enough, but this will take quite a bit of time until these interest rate hikes will bring down demand, because you kind of are relying on this very indirect measure to trickle through the system. At the same time, in this interim period where inflation is still going on, and in particular, poor households that already before inflation were spending their whole budget or more than their budget, can be in real trouble. And if the increases in interest rates actually also make their consumer credits and their mortgages and their student debts and so on more expensive, then this can be a fairly fairly challenging transitory moment. Let's put it that way. Okay, then the next question was lessons for development. Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many lessons that it's hard to even reply to this in a short and pointed way. I just want to make 3 points. I think the first point is that one of the not often pondered lessons of China's development is that agricultural development is absolutely important and central to China's growth story. The second point is that I think there is no magic bullet of development. The point is not to replace the Washington consensus with the Beijing consensus and say, okay, the kind of model that emerged in China can now be simply transferred and replicated elsewhere. That being said, I think that the Chinese experience does legitimize a greater role for the state in development compared to the Washington consensus formula, and that it challenges us to think creatively about state-market relations in ways that reflect the local context, which brings me to my third point. And I know this is slightly provocative, but I'll say it more as an impetus for thought rather than as a final conclusion. I think that if we think about the overwhelming power relations in the global economy and the enormous continuities in terms of who is exporting what and which country is in what position in the global division of labor, then from the perspective of, in particular, small developing countries, I think the question really becomes, how can you find entry points where you can kind of, through some specific local constellations, poke a hole into this global system that is completely stacked against you. And in some sense, this is what China was doing with their export processing zones, and when they realized that the smaller East Asian countries were losing their comparative advantage in light manufacturing industries, they saw an opening in the world economy and kind of jumped into this. Now China is China, it's gigantic and all of that, so they could like kind of take on the whole light industry in some sense. For other countries, I think that would require much more targeted type of thinking of where are there openings in the global economy where I, given my local constellations, might have a chance to insert myself into the global economy in ways that is productive for my own development, even though the overall picture is disadvantageous. The third question on the dual track, let me just say, this kind of follows from what I said in response to the second question. I don't think that necessarily China's system would have worked in other countries. But I do think that China's experience shows that shock therapy was not without alternatives.
Thank you, Isabella. I think just before we thank you formally, I think Andrew had one short comment to make on the inflation issue. Oh, you're mute, Andrew.
No, I was just, yeah, no, I don't want to have the last word or anything, but I just wanted to reinforce what Isabel was saying. I think what she was saying on that was excellent. And Jamie Galbraith, who's also been a big fan of yours, also came out just a couple of days ago, I think, on the Syndicate, on a piece making the point that this a purely monetary approach of focusing on interest rates in the current context is mainly focused on placing the burden of inflation adjustment on labor, on workers, on wages, and on compressing wages as a very indirect sort of smothering approach to try and bring down inflation rather than a more targeted approach that Isabel is talking about. And I think that's really important because we're not dealing with a wage push inflation right now. We're dealing with inflation coming from other sources. It's not being driven by wages. But that, again, there's a lot of really interesting discussion of wage and cost sources of inflation in Isabel's book. So, yeah.
Yeah, so we really need everyone to read it. And we should come back together again to talk about all of this. Just before I thank you and say goodbye, I wanted to say that we're terribly sorry to announce that the very last talk of this series, where Rafif Ziada was going to come to speak to us about Palestine, the context of the pandemic and the processes of deindustrialization there, we've had to cancel because the University College Union, for which many of us are members, are beginning a second phase of strike action, which will last all of next week. And so both Rafif, who also will be on strike, and many of us are really, really sorry to have to withdraw this. There may be a small chance that the university's administrations see the light, return to serious negotiation, so we could cancel this industrial action. But on that basis, if that does not happen, this is the last of our series for this academic year. And we will ask you all to look forward to the series in the next academic year. Now, Isabella Weber, Andrew Fisher, thank you very much. I mean, these are very strategic and of the moment issues. And we can see from all of this how important it is to understand history and historical processes, which are so determinant in terms of understanding the possibilities for today. So thank you very much. And I'm sure everybody would be clapping if they could actually clap on Zoom. Okay. So if you two could hang on for a moment, just while others leave. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll get a signal when